All right, so our second topic in Unit 5 is agriculture and the changes in agriculture that we generally term the Green Revolution. So let's go ahead and jump right into our PowerPoint, which is right here. There we go. Okay. So the green revolution, not green in the sense of ecologically friendly necessarily, and certainly many of the practices of the green revolution are not ecologically friendly. We're talking about massive changes in agriculture. So much like we talk about the industrial revolution, we also talk about the green revolution. And the green revolution really is the advent of industrial agriculture. So the same processes that came with the Industrial Revolution of mechanization and standardization now are being applied to food production. And one of the key things that we talk about when we talk about industrial agriculture is this idea of the energy subsidy, or the idea that for every calorie of food produced, there is some energy that goes into that. There's fossil fuel energy and there's human energy. So when we talk about more traditional forms of farming, that was mostly human energy and some livestock energy. Now there's a lot more fossil fuel energy involved. And so when we talk about the energy subsidy, we're also talking about a pretty significant carbon dioxide subsidy. So in the US, on average, according to Michael Pollan, who's a fairly famous food anthropologist, there's about a 10-calorie energy input for every 1 calorie of food. Now that's the energy to farm it, to produce the fertilizer, to transport fertilizer to the farm, to harvest the food, to then bring that harvest to market. So there's a lot of steps along that process. And most of that 10 calories comes from fossil fuel energy use. Whether that's, as I said, in the form of fertilizers and pesticides, which are produced with fossil fuels, whether that's in the tractors or the machinery, the irrigation systems, or the transportation. Okay, so the Green Revolution is this shift to mechanized farming, using fertilization, using irrigation, and using improved crop varieties over the last 100 years. It is not green in the sense of environmentally friendly. So first piece is mechanization. So this is talking about using large tractors and combines and trucks and harvesters. Mechanization relies, just as industrialization does, on economies of scale. So the average cost of production is going to fall as output increases. So the more things you can make quickly, the less expensive each of them is because it requires less human labor. That means, however, that there's a large upfront expenditure for all of this equipment, but it gets justified by the profits from that increased production. But what that means is that very often small farms can't afford that upfront cost. And so that means that on average, your small family farms have been going out of business ever since the Green Revolution. And more larger industrial farms are taking over. So if we were to look at average farm size between 1900 and 1997, we're looking at going from 150 acres to nearly 500 acres. And that is not a family farm-sized farm. This is not unique to the US, but we certainly have the largest average farm size and the fewest individual family type farms. Certainly, if you have less than 1 hectare, that's really considered to be subsistence farming. That's really only providing enough food for your family. That's not providing enough food to then also take to market. So that's mechanization, and mechanization has led to larger farm sizes. Another thing that comes along with these large farms is what we call monocropping. So monocropping is large plantings of a single species or a single variety. It's very efficient, it's very productive, it's very economical, and it's going to provide the most profit per acre. On the downside, it's also going to lead to more soil erosion. It's going to require more fertilization. It's going to result in higher vulnerability to pests, a loss of genetic diversity, and a lack of predators. Also, without crop rotation, you need a lot more fertilizers. So monocropping requires more fertilizers. Large amounts are required to replace that lost organic matter and those lost nutrients, which are mostly nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Organic fertilizers are mostly decomposed manure. However, most fertilizers that are used in homes and on the industrial farming scale are what we call synthetic fertilizers, which are produced by burning fossil fuels. Okay, another important piece of the Green Revolution is irrigation. This is incredibly necessary in many areas because there's simply not enough rainfall to sustain crops. So we have four main types of irrigation, and we'll go into these in more detail when we talk about irrigation. But the four types are furrow, flood, spray, and drip. And irrigation in general is going to drastically increase the productivity of farmland. And then we, of course, talk about pesticides. So we had synthetic fertilizers, which add nutrients to the soil. We have irrigation that adds water to the soil. And the last piece of that trifecta is pesticides. And pesticides are applied to control the damage to crops by unwanted pests, whether those are animals, fungi, bacteria, any sort of a pest, could even be rodents, and they therefore increase the productivity of the crop. So those three generally go together and are part of that industrial revolution of farming known as the Green Revolution. In the last 10 to 20 years, we've developed these things called genetically modified organisms. So we want to talk about the difference between genetically modified organisms and traditional artificial selection. We have been doing artificial selection for thousands of years. Corn, as we know it, is not a naturally occurring plant. It is a plant that was developed by selective breeding from its ancient ancestors to create modern corn. If we were to look at the cole family, so that's cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, cole, all of those are varieties of the wild mustard plant. And they've been selected by humans over thousands of years to give us the particular varieties that we choose. Modern genetic modifications are different. They isolate a specific gene from one organism and transfer it using CRISPR, and they cut out a particular gene, they put it into the plant that they want. And so it's a much faster process. It is not random, or there's a lot less randomness to it than artificial selection. So why would we do this? Because it can increase quantity, it can increase quality, it can decrease cost. Why apply a pesticide when you can engineer your plant to be naturally pest resistant? Okay, so one of the early modifications was taking a gene from Bacillus thuringiensis, which is deadly to certain insects, injecting it into corn, and now those insects can't eat that corn anymore. And so you don't have to apply pesticides. Not having to apply pesticides is a lot friendlier to all of the other insects out there. Okay. Another benefit is being able to add essential nutrients to a particular plant. One of the early success stories of genetically modified organisms is a species called golden rice. So one of the main problems in developing countries, one of the main diseases is blindness caused by a vitamin A deficiency. Most of those countries get a lot of their nutrition from rice. And so they've genetically modified rice with the gene from actually daffodils to cause the rice to actually produce vitamin A as it goes through photosynthesis. And then you have a rice, a cheap, inexpensive food source that contains the vitamin whose deficiency causes blindness. It's the #1 leading cause of preventable blindness in the world is vitamin A deficiency. And so you can develop things that solve an entire area's problems. They're also using genetically modified organisms to produce pharmaceutical compounds. It reduces the cost of manufacturing them. So rather than manufacturing insulin in a plant or factory, we literally make a plant do it for us. We insert a gene into it, and then we can use that to actually produce insulin. So genetically modified organisms, they reduce expenses, they increase profits, they lower food prices. They can even help to solve issues with nutrition and issues with pesticides, which lead to environmental issues. But there are concerns, and this is what you hear more about. Are they safe for human consumption? We simply don't have evidence. It may be that food allergies are an issue. There's not any evidence that they're not, but there's also not adequate evidence that they are. Are there going to be effects on biodiversity? So if you have a genetically modified organism being grown in a field next to a non-genetically modified organism, can they interbreed? Is that going to reduce biodiversity? Is that going to reduce the genetic diversity of our populations? And then, of course, one of the main issues with genetically modified organisms is patenting. Companies spend a lot of money to develop these genetically modified organisms, and they develop patents on them. And so farmers are not allowed to save seeds from genetically modified organisms and grow them again the next year. That's considered a trademark violation. And so if you look at the landscape of genetically modified organisms, the interesting thing is that there are 4 firms that are responsible for 73% of global pesticide and seed sales. And those 4 companies make both pesticides and seeds. They make genetically modified organism seeds. And guess what? Monsanto, the people who make glyphosate, which you guys probably know as a Roundup, they've developed Roundup resistant plants. They sell the pesticide, they sell the seed, they pretty much own the market. So this does get into some issues of monopolies and of control. So are there any regulations? Not in the US. It's not mandated that we label genetically modified organisms. You will see a lot of voluntary labeling of non-genetically modified organisms or plant products made with not genetically modified organisms. But the truth of the matter is that in the US, you're probably eating genetically modified organisms. Even if it's not intentional, there does tend to be drift between fields. The European Union bans a lot of genetically modified organisms. Your organic food cannot contain genetically modified organisms by the regulations around organic. The problem is we don't know if there's anything wrong with GMOs or not. And if there's not, why should we label it? So we get into a lot of gray areas with labeling or not labeling genetically modified organisms. So that's kind of the big picture of the Green Revolution, of the changes in agriculture since the introduction of industrial agriculture. Mechanization, monocropping, fertilization, irrigation, pesticides, and genetically modified organisms. And we'll talk about all of the advantages and drawbacks of those in class. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.